Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide Stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. The Alamo is known for many things: a Spanish mission, a battlefield, a treasured historic site. But one of its lesser-known distinctions is being home to the first hospital in Texas. Today we reveal how medical science shaped the Alamo, from the world's first documented vaccine being administered on its grounds to the backdrop of the battle's last stand being right inside the hospital. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. Today we're joined by Thomas Ledesma, the Alamo's researcher, and Morgan Oldham, the Alamo's STEAM education specialist. Thank you both for being here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thomas, when visitors come to the Alamo, medicine is probably not the first thing on their minds, but it's truly part of the fabric of the historical tapestry of the site.
That's right, Emily. I mean, most folks walk up to the site and they recognize the iconic Alamo Church. And a lot of times the long barrack or convento off to the left-hand side doesn't get a lot of attention. People are kind of curious on what that is. Folks are curious about that building and don't know its story. And as you said in the introduction, on that site specifically that the first hospital is established.
Morgan, as we've talked about before on the podcast, STEAM education is science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. So medical science is a big topic you explore with students.
Definitely. It's one of my favorites to talk about with students. And in medicine, you really combine all of those aspects of STEAM. So it's really cool to really see all those come together.
Thomas, the Alamo's medical history really begins when Mission San Antonio de Valero secularized in the 1790s.
That's right. By the early 1790s, by 1795, the mission's going to be secularized. All the missions are going to be secularized. But Valero has some interesting aspects to it. One, it's in pretty close proximity to the Via of San Fernando de Bejar, which, city center today, main plaza, military plaza, the San Fernando Church, but it's not completed. The other missions to some degree are finished, and the churches are finished specifically. Valero's mission church is not. And so you have this building without a roof on it, and when the headquarters element from the Franciscan missions come up here and take a evaluation, they're saying, well, you've succeeded for the most part in your duties. People are going to church. They are paying taxes. They're Spanish subjects through and through. They're speaking Spanish, adopting to this culture. Pack up and move on. You're not supposed to be here permanently. And plus, if anybody wants to stay in this area, they can go roughly today, about 8 blocks to where San Fernando Church is and get service there. But there's another issue that happens as well. We have the Louisiana Purchase occurring. And with that, Spain and France had always kind of traded back the Louisiana territory to keep it out of the hands of the British and later on the United States. And so when Napoleon sells the purchase to Jefferson, the Spanish want to take a more aggressive approach on the border. So they're going to have a bolstered presence on the border, but also they need to figure out this headquarters element. And of course, that's when they begin to look at San Antonio and more specifically Old Mission Valero.
Plus, there's another threat facing the Spanish Empire, and that is smallpox.
Exactly right. You have this global pandemic spreading across the empire, and we have to remember that the Spanish crown is in control of a huge portion of the world, stretching from Asia all the way to the Americas. And so they're going to have to do something about that.
Morgan, how developed was medical theory like this at the time? What was the approach to fighting viruses?
The approach was very different from today. So the prevailing medical theory of the time was the 4 humors, sometimes called humorism or humoral theory. And that was really the predominant medical theory for centuries, if not thousands of years. And according to the 4 humors, there are 4 fluids that make up your body. There's blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And at the time, they believed that illnesses and diseases came from an imbalance in one of those humors. So the medical interventions that were in practice often were in an effort to balance those humors. So maybe taking some excess blood or things like that.
Things that make you feel very grateful we were born in the modern era.
Definitely, yeah.
In the early 1800s, the King of Spain calls for a vaccination campaign across the New World. It's easy for us today to talk about vaccinations. They've been around our whole lives. This was truly groundbreaking.
Yeah, every time we have groups come by, whether they're medical groups or military groups or anything in that realm, it all comes down to logistics. I We even think about the school kids that we have visit. It all comes down to logistics, right? And so we can imagine that today with ships, modern ships and airplanes and things like that. But imagine in the 1800s having to get that kind of supply and logistic across the Atlantic. But in about 1803, King Carlos IV is going to approach the Council of the Indies, who is the main governmental body administering to these colonies in the Americas, saying we need to go ahead and formulate a plan to get vaccinations to the New World and to New Spain and the other holdings in the Americas. And so they established the Royal Philanthropic Vaccine Expedition, aka the Balmis Salvani Expedition. And they are going to set forth a request to all the governmental bodies in the colonies to go ahead and prepare for this expedition to get to their cities and towns. And San Antonio, Texas is mentioned on that list of places that they want to have vaccination.
The Alamo's Lawn Barrack became the first hospital in Texas around this time. What would that have looked like?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. And I think it's very interesting to see what letters are coming out. And in May of 1804, the governor for the province of Texas sends out these letters to the various cities. Writes this: "The king has received the welcome notice of the safe arrival at the American continent of the maritime expedition destined to propagate among his beloved vassals of the Indies the admirable discovery of a vaccine. He hopes that the director and other individuals commissioned to discharge these obligations will have agreed to communicate it in the principal towns of this vast dominion." And he goes on to say that we expect that certain locations will be set aside for the administration of these vaccines, basically saying you have to find a space suitable to serve as a clinic or hospital. Well, here at the Alamo, we understand that that location is going to be the former convento, or what we call today the Lawn Barrack. Thinking about the buildings in that time period, they've been abandoned for somewhat of a time. At the same point, the second flying company of San Carlos de Alamo de Parras, the Alamo Company, has moved in and turn it into their headquarters. But the buildings are not necessarily in great shape. And a little bit later, we have letters from the second physician that we'll talk about that's in charge of the Alamo, talking about the decrepit nature of the buildings. He says the Lawn Barrack roof is leaking. They don't have enough beds. They tried to order more beds and they can't get enough mattress filling for them. They're on the floor. And so they talk about having to rebuild parts of the old mission as a pharmacy and et cetera. So if you're a physician here, whether on the vaccine expedition or as a permanent physician here for the garrison, you have your hands filled just dealing with the physical building itself. That's something that we still deal with today, right? Keeping these structures up and running.
Right. And at the time, the physical building would have been 2 stories.
That's correct.
And you said something else in that letter that was interesting, the discovery of the vaccine. That really points to this was the first real vaccine in the world.
Yes, it was. I do think it's important to note that for centuries, there's evidence of efforts for inoculation across the world. As early as the 14th century, there are reports of inoculation efforts across India, China, and even into West Africa. So these efforts took place for a long time. Smallpox plagued humans for a really, really long time. But vaccination is a little different from just inoculation. So previously, these inoculation efforts often involved intentionally infecting people with smallpox. However, when we get to the end of the 1700s, any of those familiar with the smallpox vaccination probably know the name Edward Jenner. He is the one credited with coining the term vaccination, which comes from the Latin and Spanish word for cow, which is vaca. So that is a fun fact about the etymology of the word vaccination, because the first vaccinations were from cowpox, which is a virus similar to smallpox. But once infected with cowpox, it causes an infection, but it is much more survivable, much less dangerous than smallpox. And so really, the first vaccinations were done by Edward Jenner on his gardener's child. And at the time, they did not have hypodermic needles yet. So instead of a syringe and a needle, they would use a lancet. So kind of like a little scalpel. They would make a cut and then take pus from a blister from someone else who has cowpox and place it underneath or rub it on the skin.
That gives really good perspective of what you could expect when you were going to the Lawn Barrack for your smallpox vaccine.
Definitely.
So around this time, the Alamo gets its first formal physicians. Tell us about them.
That's right. So in about 1804, 1805 or so, you have these orders coming through that we're going to have a physician here in San Antonio to take care of the military garrison from the Second Flying Company, but really throughout. So the soldiers that are posted at La Bahia or Goliad, even further east on the border of Louisiana, all these folks will be here. And what's interesting is how the first physician gets here. Dr. Federico Zervan is living in Spanish Louisiana at this point, and now it goes to being French Louisiana very shortly, and then the U.S. Louisiana. So he's going to leave. And he comes into Mexico, and he's somewhere around Monterrey when he ends up kind of attaching himself to this trip that the Archbishop of Monterrey is making throughout northern Mexico, if you will, at the time. And when they get to San Antonio, the Archbishop goes, well, you need a physician. There's one in my entourage here. You can have him. And what's interesting is a letter we have from one of the governmental authorities here. And he writes, Divine Providence was pleased to permit the most illustrious bishop of this diocese on his departure to his headquarters to leave in this capital city a good doctor in medicine and surgery who was accompanying him. The latter, provided with a small medicine case, has, in the space of 1 month, not only cured perfectly the governor addressing your lordship and about 100 soldiers, but also about 300 other persons in the township who are afflicted with various disorders. And so he's talking about how wonderful it is to have a physician here. And then he goes a little bit later to say, to favor this aid sent to us by heaven, I have provided without any cost whatever and availing myself only to a little arbitration the equipment of a partly ruined chamber in the secularized mission of Valero as a medical infirmary. I have ordered it provided with beds made of reeds in order to avoid the dampness of the ground. The patients of all the companies or posts who may be sent here will be placed in them under the necessary care of a nurse, a woman to take care of the kitchen, and a guard from the company of the Alamo, which is stationed in the mission. And so we can see the beginnings of this formal medical presence. And Zervan, as the letter states, is doing an okay job, but there's a little bit more to that. He is actually sort of on the run from some gambling debts in Louisiana. His wife has unfortunately passed away, and it seems like during his marriage, he had taken out some loans from her brothers and failed to repay them. And her brothers are like, hey, you're leaving to Texas. We need your money before you disappear on us. And so there becomes this drawn out process with that. He ends up living with a local priest, and they like to play cards and gamble a little bit at night, and that devolves into a pretty strenuous relationship. He's not really recorded in the records of having a great bedside manner and helping. He kind of is accused of being a quack at one point. And the people of San Antonio have had enough. So they write a letter to the governor saying, hey, you need to help us with this. And the governor responds to the mayor essentially saying, who are you to be judging this man so wise in the ways of science? And, if it's not, you don't know what to do, so you need to be quiet or I'm going to remove you from your office because this is what we got and we got to go with it. But all those complaints and those gambling debts eventually catch up to Zervan and he will be dismissed from service.
And then we get a second doctor at the Alamo.
That's right. And so the second doctor we get, Dr. Jaime Gurza, is fantastic. He was trained in Spain as a medical physician. He comes into New Spain and serves in several garrisons in the area and then is posted to San Antonio. And he's really everything encompassed. And he says, this is my orders. He's a truly military physician. But not only is he caring about the patients, but he begins to send out records about what the state of the hospital looks like. That's another issue we have. The civilian manager for the hospital is writing to the governor about Zervan's time there and says, hey, this building is not gotten any better. We're having some major issues here. And he seems pretty lackadaisical about getting them fixed. But Dr. Gurza is definitely the opposite of that. And during his tenure, he writes a report that also gives us an insight on what the building looked like. He said, report of the repairs that must be made to the building of the military hospital according to the deterioration of it and which has been examined. It threatens to ruin the building. All the rooms must be unroofed because all the shingles and beams are rotten. And 496 andirons must be replaced because they are crumbling and rotting. The floors in the rooms and corridors of the infirmary upstairs and downstairs must be repaired. The chinks in all the walls, inside and out, must be filled with small rocks and mortar. The corners of the north rooms, which is falling down, must be wrecked and rebuilt. A new wall must be raised for the rooms facing the east, for it is completely deteriorated. The roofing and the gutters must be rebuilt because they are rotten and useless.
Lawn Barracks not that old at this point.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to see the kind of the neglect that's happened very quickly. And obviously, we have construction issues during the mission period. The church is never finished. There's not a roof on it. It's so hard in this kind of way to build a mission on the frontier and have to deal with all these other things. Security, securing your food stores, combating against disease, and then finding people who are skilled enough to build the building. So, some of it sure could be quote unquote unskilled labor, but even at that, you have experts who are used to doing these things over time. And if somebody gets sick or gets hurt, well, now you're down.
Or there's just no upkeep over time.
Exactly right. And that's today.
What do we know about how the hospital would have functioned from an administrative standpoint?
We do have some idea in the records from the Bexar County Archives, which is a fantastic resource for anybody who's interested in learning. Picking some of the information out of there, we see that when Zervan starts, he's getting paid at 60 pesos a month, which is including him getting paid for additional duties, which is medicine prep. Being a pharmacist back then is also a separate job. And they try to get a specific pharmacist here, but that never really works out. And then they also set aside money for pharmacists to come up here, and they're about 25 to 30 pesos a month. So about half the pay of the doctor. It's mentioned that one male nurse at 6 pesos a month will be here. By 1808, they kind of increase that because they're having an increase of patients here. One female cook and one male porter at 3 pesos a month each. And then the guard from the Alamo company. Those men will be paid an additional couple pesos as an additional duty to their service. But then they also bring in the administrative level. They bring in a financial and operations officer to look over the hospital because, again, there's under Zervan's tenure, there's some questions about how much money is being spent on supplies, where this money is going. I mean, at one point, supposedly the record is stating that Zervan is taking certain things from the inventory saying, oh, I'll replace them later on. But when he gets released from his duties, he has no money to pay him. And so they actually auction off a lot of his personal belongings to pay these debts.
Morgan, what were some of the common medicines or medical tools used at the time?
So one of the most common medicines that were used at the time involved mercury, which we know today to be very toxic to your health. And mercury also was used for centuries, even into the 1950s. And at this time, the most popular form of mercury that was being used was called calomel. When we talk about the medicines of that time, it's important to go back to the four humors because those medical interventions were done with the intention of purging or getting rid of an excess humor. So when taking mercury, for example, or calomel, it would often cause purging. So you may vomit, you may explosively empty your bowels, and that was the goal. It was also used to treat yellow fever on record, even mental illness, teething babies. Mercury was used for almost everything, across social classes, across ages, from little babies to elderly people as well.
And the medical tools, things like the bowl for bloodletting, things like that.
Yes, definitely. And going back to bloodletting too, they would have had lancets, scalpels, even leeches were used to get rid of any excess blood. Some of the tools they used look eerily similar to tools that are still used today, like forceps, the trephine that was like the little handheld drill to drill like circular holes into the skull. They look very similar to today.
Operating a hospital on the frontier was not without challenges. Revolts and skirmishes are just happening all around you.
That's right. I mean, there's so many things that you have to take into account. We mentioned earlier a little bit about the logistics of pay and things like that. And there's one letter that is found, or report that's found in the archives that gives us an inside view into kind of the financial part of it. And it says this: although the prices seem excessive, in reality they are not if one takes into account the distances everything is brought. For, as your lordship knows, this province produces nothing. The reason for the increased expense of said two accounts in comparison with those previously rendered is that Dr. Don Federico Zervan regarded the important matter of the hospital, as I noted, with great indifference. And so you have a bunch of challenges. One is you're getting stuff from the pharmacy in Monterrey or Mexico City with mules.
Because it's not made here.
Exactly right. Here to San Antonio, you have obviously threats that are all along that route, whether that is highwaymen or just Mother Nature, possibly Native American raids, things like that. But then as you're mentioning revolts, we know that in 1810 from 1821, New Spain is involved in this gigantic consuming revolution. And San Antonio is not untouched by that. We have the Casas Revolt, you have the Gutierrez-Magee expedition, the Battle of Medina is occurring. You have all these different things that are happening. And of course, the resources that are set here for the hospital. Gurza will be here during some of those early revolutions. He'll be imprisoned, and the local authorities have to plead with the Spanish army to let him out, saying, look, both sides, whether they're rebels or the royalists, let him out. He's a physician. Yes, he's trained and was in the Spanish army and is a loyal soldier, but he also has that duty as a physician to help whoever's injured. He will do that. So he gets released for a little bit, but being imprisoned has really worn him out. And so he'll retire and go back below the Rio Grande.
And in 1821, Mexico declares its independence from Spain. That's a big shakeup impacting so much of everyday life, including the hospital here at the Alamo.
That's right. And as I mentioned, it's kind of during those early revolutions and the fights for independence from Spain, a lot of the resources are taken back. Really, in the 1820s, early 1820s, there's one physician that's sent up to San Antonio to help for the military garrison specifically. But then later on, he's recalled down south because of some disturbances. And you really just have civilian doctors filling in for the whole community. There's not really a specific military presence in terms of medical support here. But of course, the 1830s come around, we begin to see the clouds of revolution and revolt in Mexico happening again.
And during the Texas Revolution, the hospital at the Lawn Barrack remained vital to, frankly, both sides, the Texans and the Mexicans, as the site switched hands a couple of times.
At the outbreak of the revolution, you're going to have medical services that are needed on both sides. You're going to have a medical presence more than likely in San Antonio itself when General Cos is still in charge of the city. And then, of course, when he leaves, you have colonists that are stepping up with medical expertise helping developing their site as well.
But there's a key figure at this time, Dr. Amos Pollard. Tell us about him.
That's right. So Dr. Pollard is going to be born in Massachusetts. He's going to move around in New England. When he's a young boy, they move to New Hampshire. He decides that he doesn't want to be a farmer like his father is and wants to be a doctor. And so he enrolls in the Vermont Academy in Castleton, Vermont, which one of the buildings is still there from the school. I got to visit that about 2 years ago, but the original location is no longer there. But he studies medicine there, graduates about 1826 or so, and then goes down to New York. And he's in the middle of it, New York City, he's there in Manhattan and other places. Also Boston, the records might show he does some practicing in Boston for a little bit. And then in the beginning of the 1830s, he begins to hear about Texas. We think about, okay, a lot of people are coming from Louisiana, maybe Arkansas and things like that. But this whole idea about going to Texas really is up and down the eastern seaboard, which is majority of the United States, really, at that time, at least population-wise. And so he hears about this. He brings his family down to New Orleans. Unfortunately, his wife passes away about 1831 or so, and he'll send his daughter back to live with her grandparents, and he decides to come to Texas via New Orleans. And so he ends up in Columbia and begins to try to figure out where he's going to set up his practice and begin his new life in Texas. Hopefully succeeds in bringing his daughter down in the future.
And he makes it to the Alamo.
That's right. So Dr. Pollard is a group of several individuals that are at the Alamo that have medical experience. There's about 7 individuals who have some sort of medical knowledge that we know of. Some of them are physicians or doctors. Some of them are learning their early stages, like William Sutherland, who's here with his uncle. He's moving here to Texas because his uncle's a doctor and he wants to learn from him, but unfortunately he'll never get the chance to fulfill that dream. But it all starts off in the beginning in October of 1835. We have the come and take it skirmish in Gonzales or battle in Gonzales, and you have several individuals who rally to the aid of the Old 18 helping out. It's quite possible that Amos Pollard is one of them. And one of the interesting things is a few days after, on October 7th, Colonel Moore of the militia gets a letter from several individuals. And it's very interesting. Dated Gonzales, October 7th, 1835. To John H. Moore, commanding colonel. You are hereby requested to accept the medical services of the undersigned, who without any distinction of grade have with a special eye to the good of their country constituted themselves a board for the volunteer Army of Texas. With sentiments of both consideration, we subscribe ourselves yours sincerely. And you have William P. Smith, Thomas B. Glazy, T. Kenny, Joseph E. Field, and Amos Pollard. And they're saying, we're doctors, we want to help. And they do. Now, of course, after Gonzales, you have the attack at Goliad, and the Mexican army withdraws there. They withdraw to San Antonio. You have the siege and the Battle of Behar happening. And Amos Pollard is cited several times for his actions helping the men during the Battle of Behar. And what's really neat is we have one of the casualty records now in our possession in the collection, done in his handwriting, we believe, or at least it's signed by him, saying these are the casualties from the Battle of Behar, of course, including Colonel Ben Milam, who's shot in the Vermendy Palace. And so it's very interesting to see how a lot of these men get involved early on.
And he was here during the siege of the Alamo when the hospital and the lawn barrack faced some challenges.
That's right. And that's another thing about the letters that we have from the Alamo. And we see the struggle that Pollard is having. He's writing about the issues of discipline in the fort and things like that. But he's also saying it's very echoey of what the engineer Green Jameson writes. How can we expect these men to be prepared for battle and to help entrench and make sure the fortress is ready, both the town and the fort, or even just be in fighting condition if they haven't been supplied well? And we think of gunshot wounds and things like that, battle wounds, but as a physician, he's looking at the overall health of these individuals. And he's saying they're not clothed, they're not being fed. And so we have some issues here. How can we expect our men to be ready if they are not healthy enough? But he also writes about how they're very low in medical supplies, specifically medicines. He writes to Governor Smith, he writes to Sam Houston and some other individuals saying, I have a lot of instruments, I have a lot of tools, but I don't have the medicine that I need in case we have people sick. And we believe there could be maybe 20 or so individuals still from the Battle of Behar on the colonist side that are ill and still needing care. Of course, some Mexican soldiers had been left behind, some from the Alamo Company, more than likely, that are from San Antonio, elect to stay here, we know that, or are injured and can't make the trip back. So it's not a far idea that Pollard or other individuals that are here in this world are supposed to also offer them aid, obviously, until the enemy arrives. So it's very heartbreaking, though, to a certain extent, to read these letters of Pollard, how desperate he sounds, saying, we need help, we need supply, when can we expect it to get here?
Then during the March 6th Battle of the Alamo, hand-to-hand fighting is taking place in the lawn barrack, where it bears repeating, people are literally in the hospital.
Sure. We still believe that the hospital for the garrison is in the second floor. Several different accounts reference that. There's also several accounts that reference entrenchments being made on the first floor. And so you can imagine on the morning of March 6th, all this combat that is occurring before the sun comes up. It's utter chaos. You've been besieged for almost 2 weeks. You're exhausted again, lack of supplies. You're waiting for reinforcements. You have this hope that they're coming, but nobody showed up yet. Luckily, the guys from Gonzales and the Mortal 32 have shown up, so that lifts your spirits a bit, but a large relief force hasn't arrived. But if you're Travis, you're getting letters saying, for God's sake, hold on, give us more time. And so you probably are living on that hope. And on the morning when the attack materializes, the Battle of the Alamo breaks down into battles for specific areas. And you have men that are fighting on the north wall. They're fighting on the southwest corner with the 18-pounder, fighting at the palisade, fighting on the western wall, so on and so forth. And of course, you're going to fall back. You're getting pushed off of your positions. And one of the several locations you can fall back to is the Long Barrack. And no doubt there's men that are on the first floor fighting in those entrenchments, but no doubt there's men going onto the second floor to get an advantage of height and fighting. And we have to believe that somebody like Pollard more than likely is attending to his patients, bringing new patients in, and also defending his patients once the Mexican infantry begins to make their way through the building. And of course, like the rest of the Alamo defenders, Amos Pollard will not be spared and he'll be killed, more than likely defending the patients in the hospital.
There were Mexican soldiers who survived the battle, but with bullet wounds or other kinds of wounds. Morgan, how were those wounds treated at the time?
So it really depended on where in the body the gunshot wound was. So if it was in an extremity, like an arm, leg, amputation was fairly common. Otherwise, they would probe for the bullet. Often bullets would stay within the body. They did not go all the way through like today. So they would maybe use their fingers. They did have longer forceps as well if it was deeper in there. And then sometimes if it was a deeper wound, they could pack linen or wool in there. By this time, physicians do know that cauterizing wounds, so heating them, can stem some of that blood loss. So that's likely practice as well as stitching.
Did they know that if you stuff something in there, you could get an infection?
Not yet. So in the 1830s, we are not really to the development and acceptance of germ theory. So even if you survived blood loss from that original injury, you definitely are able to get an infection. I know Thomas mentioned earlier the malnutrition that some of the soldiers were facing. So with malnutrition, it takes a lot longer for wounds to heal. So with that wound being open for longer, you get more of a chance of infection.
What would the painkillers of the time have been?
At the time, opium is used. Often it's mixed into a tincture with alcohol. So I don't know if the Alamo defenders would have had that, because I know Amos Pollard was mentioning, I have tools, but I don't have medicines.
Talking about the supplies inside the Alamo and what challenges Amos Pollard is facing, in this letter written to Governor Smith, he writes, "It is my duty to inform you that my department is nearly destitute of medicine, and in the event of a siege, I can be of very little use to the sick under such circumstances. I have plenty of instruments with the exception of a trepanning case, some catheters, and an injection syringe, which would complete the station. I write you this because I suppose the Surgeon General not to be in the country, and we are threatened with a large invading army."
At what point did the Lawn Barracks stop being used as a hospital?
Really, probably after the Mexican army leaves when the war is over in 1836. In a previous episode, we discussed what the Mexican army's operations look like at the Alamo after the battle. And so we know that there is a hospital set up, whether it's in the Alamo or outside, a medical hospital to take care of the wounded from the Mexican army as best as they can. We know that physicians from Goliad are spared from the massacre and sent here to render aid. But really, after the revolution is over in April, nobody's really utilizing the site that much.
But that's not where the Alamo's history with doctors ends. If you go into the Alamo Church, you can spot historic graffiti left behind by a doctor.
That's right, Emily. I think a lot of people are shocked when they come into the church and they see this historic graffiti on the outside, and then they go inside, and there's even several more really ornate, in some cases, visible graffiti. And one of the more interesting sections of graffiti is in what we call Monk's Burial Chamber, which we call the temporary sacristy today. And so if you're walking into the Alamo Church, you look to the left, you see the confessional, and that'll be the next room opening you see. And for an everyday visitor, you may look at the doorway and think, oh, this could be an original walkway. But we know from work by our conservator that originally was probably a window almost. And what happens when the U.S. Army arrives, they begin to look at modifying the church in about 1850 or so, right? That's when they put the roof on. They make some openings for windows and different things. And they probably want to make that windowway a square door. You can secure it with a square door. You can have easier access than having to walk all the way the length of the church, then looping back around. And so while working in that room, our conservator was looking at that wall right above that opening and realized that must have been a void there, or something led her to believe that this should be explored deeper. And she had gotten permission to remove some of the plaster that was on there by the U.S. Army and so forth, and reveal this Spanish colonial archway that would have been there. And within this archway were two names written on the walls. And one of them is A Work, 1848. And then another one, a larger font next to it, says I.E. Oatman, M.D., 1847. Now, tracking down the names on the church is something that is very difficult to do. You could imagine how many people have the same name throughout the area and whatnot, but why not give it a shot? And several other researchers and historians have tried to track down who this Oatman may have been. And so I took it upon myself to kind of continue that track. My first thought was, let's look at U.S. Army muster rolls if we can find any for who are the medical officers serving here at that time. And nothing really came up. So it was sort of hitting another dead end. I just began looking up I.E. Oatman's burial records in the 1840s or birth records in the early 1800s to the 1860s and 70s and even up to the 80s, looking for individuals. And I came across one person that had a pretty interesting story, and his name was Ira Ellis Oatman. Now, he was a very well-known doctor in the late 1800s in Sacramento, where he ended up passing away. But he was born in the Midwest. And so about 1819, he was born in New Albany, Indiana. He stayed in that area, got married in Chicago in 1839. By 1845, he graduates from one of the best medical schools in the area, the Rush Medical School in Chicago. And census records that I found about this individual still had him in that area in 1850. But then there's a jump in 1860 to California. Well, sort of another dead end. I don't see any mentions of Texas here. There's no service record of him in the U.S. military coming to Texas and serving in this area in the 1840s, as the graffiti suggests he would have been here by. And so I'm thinking, here, okay, another dead end. But looking into his family is where I revealed some more information that may lead us to this person being connected to the person's name in the church. In 1847, Ira E. Oatman has his first child, his son Eugene. But something is happening right before that. His parents, John Oatman and Nancy Mae Nance, later on Nancy Oatman, had been married in 1806 in Indiana, moved around Indiana and Illinois, and then eventually they began to move to Texas. So from 1845 annexation to about 1850, you see the senior Oatmans moving to Texas, but then also some of his older siblings are moving there as well. And by 1856, they're becoming pretty well known in the community around Llano, Bastrop, Travis County, Seguin even. So really this central Texas, north central Texas area, if you will. What I'm thinking is, if his firstborn son is in 1847 and by 1850 his family's already in Texas, there's a good possibility that he's coming down here to visit his family to show off his firstborn son. And we believe that, kind of like a tradition that most people do today, you're going to meet your family, you're going to come down to see your family, and where are they going to take you? To some of the big town. At that time, obviously would have been San Antonio, would have been one of the biggest ones, but also something iconic and still well known, which is the Alamo Church. I mean, we even see that with the U.S. Army. Even though they're turning this into a quartermaster depot, they're still talking about the reverent nature of the site and the legendary battle that happened here.
Left his permanent mark on the Alamo.
He did.
Whenever we talk about this historic graffiti, we always have to say, while it does help us understand who came through San Antonio and why, today, graffiti would get you a one-way ticket to the Bexar County Jail, and you'd be charged with a state felony.
Don't do it.
Back to medicine, though. Morgan, during this U.S. Army era, there were big medical advancements taking place.
Definitely. The mid 1800s to the late 1800s is when we finally get to the development and acceptance of germ theory, which is the foundation of modern medicine, and where we know that bacteria, viruses, other germs cause certain diseases. So at this time, across the world, you're seeing an increase in hygiene and sanitation in the medical practice, especially in the 1850s with the Crimean War. You have women who are nurses like Florence Nightingale really revolutionizing medicine and introducing those hand-washing procedures. And maybe we should change these bloody sheets and things like that.
I imagine some of the students learning this history will grow up to be doctors, nurses, medical technicians. And even for the rest of us, this is still such a cool facet of Alamo history to learn about.
Yeah, and there's definitely a modern connection today. You know, it just doesn't end in the 1800s. Today we have Joint Base San Antonio and the Medical Center of Excellence at Fort Sam. And even today we still have groups of nurses, PAs, physicians, corpsmen, all kinds of folks coming through here and learning about this medical history specifically. And it's really neat to be able to show these service members their lineage back to the 1800s, I should say, with the Spanish hospital, military hospital being here, and them being here at the largest installation in North America. It's really cool to see that thread.
And it makes me wonder, because I know you mentioned earlier, it makes you happy that you're living in 2025. And students say the same thing. They're always like, oh my gosh, I'm glad I don't live in 1805. And it always makes me wonder, in 200 more years, what people are going to look at our medical practices, like, because we're like, they were consuming mercury. Oh my goodness. So I wonder what they're going to think of our medical practices today.
Maybe in 200 years, someone will unearth an MP3 file. What is that?
Right, yeah.
Of the Alamo podcast
Oh
and
my
wonder what we're
Yes.
talking about.
Yes, definitely.
I hope so.
Thomas Ledesma and Morgan Oldham, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We have linked to several Ask the Alamo videos featuring our living history team, showing some of the medical tools used on the frontier, plus an Ask the Alamo showing Thomas pointing out the historic graffiti he just described. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.